and we're going to be sharing it. There it is. We're going to be sharing it out afterwards. So don't worry, you'll get the recording to your email, usually within the next like 24 hours, sometimes less. And we will also have plenty of time for Q&A. So, please post any of your questions for the team in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, just so we can keep track of them and then ask them when the time comes for Q&A. And we'll try to answer as many as we can. Great. And with that, I'll introduce myself first and then hand it over to some of our fantastic speakers from Food for Climate League, Stephanie Civitello and Chavi Jotwani, to introduce themselves. My name is Colleen Pate. I'm the Customer and Community Marketing Manager here at Dscout. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm dialing in from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll hand it over to you first, Stephanie.
That's good. Hi there, I'm Stephanie. I'm the Senior Design Researcher at Food for Climate League, and I'm zooming in from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I will send it to Chavi next.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Chavi. I'm right now calling from California, but I'm usually based in Italy. I'm a product designer by trade with over 10 years of experience at the intersection of food sustainability and innovation. And at FCL, I guide our research approach to develop interventions that facilitate climate smart choices.
Great. Thank you both. And thanks for everyone joining today. We have a great session planned as they share more about the work that Food for Climate League has been doing, as well as doing a deep dive into their current Cool Beans project. So with that, let's start with you, Chavi, to share some more information about FCL, what the mission of the organization is, and what you've been working on.
Yeah, thank you. So we are a trailblazing, women-led 501c3 nonprofit working to make climate smart food choices the norm. And so we conduct targeted and integrative research that is grounded in behavioral science and self-determination theory with eaters and food system stakeholders to identify and develop strategies that can shift our food norms. So this is how we define our climate smart food culture. A lot of these are a reality in different geographies. A climate smart food culture being plant forward, regenerative, respectful of resources. But we also want to make this a reality just globally. Like, how can we celebrate diversity? How can we improve human nutrition through our food, connect communities, and do all of that by making sure it's still affordable and accessible to everyone? But the reality is that many of our problems today stem from the food system. Global food systems are responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. We know that it's the #1 driver for biodiversity loss, land degradation, deforestation. And we live in this ultimate paradox where 2 billion people go hungry while 3 billion people are obese. But we know that by changing what and how we eat, we can make a dent towards a climate positive environment. Food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. So how do we do that? How do we what will it take to make climate smart food choices the norm? At FCL, we create narratives and behavioral design strategies that position climate smart food culture as accessible, enticing, and culturally relevant to the masses. A culture that is aligned with people's needs, values, and priorities. We have set ourselves an ambitious goal to empower 100 million people by 2030, inclusive of background and socioeconomic status, to engage in these food choices, reshaping the future of food nationally and globally. And we're going to talk about how we're doing that, starting from beans in Chicago through our Dscout study.
Thanks, Chavi. I think with that, Stephanie, can you kind of take us through what is the Cool Beans project and where it got started?
Yeah, for sure. So go to the next slide. Yeah, we are focusing on beans because they're really this essential climate smart alternative to meat. And as you can see in this like side-by-side comparison, they are kind of a fraction of the cost of animal meat. They produce far fewer emissions, and they compete on a relatively even playing field when it comes to protein. But the issue is, at the same time, we're seeing on the next slide here, bean consumption is incredibly low in the US. So beans are really plentiful, but we eat less than half of the global average per capita per day. And I'm not going to go through every bullet here, but the one at the bottom I found particularly striking in our secondary research. So basically, on average, we spend less on beans per person per year than what one would spend on a Big Mac, which on average is about like $5.17. Last I looked that up as an economic reference. And that leads us to our project. So on the next slide, please. So at FCL, much of our research is focused on Gen Z and millennial eaters and how they shape food culture and how they shape demand in the food system. And one unique stakeholder group in this arena are influencers, and we were interested in how they might inspire eaters to embrace beans and increase their consumption and overall just elevate their status. And so we've started this research within the city of Chicago due to our existing network of partnerships, and we'll soon be expanding that to other cities and regions to embrace what are those different nuances in different areas and different eating contexts. And all of this is to really inform best practices for how to talk about beans and showcase them, and leading into larger campaigns that reach different audiences. And this work is funded by Good Chaos. And then we also collaborate with Beans is How, which is an international effort that is organized by the UN Sustainable Development Goal #2 Advocacy Hub. So they really seek to end hunger and promote sustainable agriculture and improve nutrition. Yeah, next slide, please. Thanks. So over the last year, we've conducted a boatload of research. And these activities kind of fall into first kind of defining and reframing the problem at hand and identifying who is that optimal audience to target initially and prioritize with our research, and then articulating the current narrative of beans using secondary sources of information, kind of setting the playing field of how are we talking about beans today, what is elevating their status, what is lowering their status. From there, we diagnose what are the needs of our eater audience, what are their values, and how can that spark new narratives surrounding beans and get people excited about beans. And then from that, testing these new narratives with larger audiences. That's kind of the broad overview here. Yeah.
And then I'm wondering, like where does the Dscout of it all come in? You can walk through that.
Yeah, so Dscout really, or need for Dscout was kind of sparked by our desire to hear from real people, not just about what they thought about beans, but also build in these really great opportunities for co-creation. So I'll call out one kind of question set as an example. So, and I think it was like activity 4 or 5, we asked them about how they would swap out meat for beans in a dish. So first we had scouts tell us what dish they would choose and how they would swap it, and what flavors would they incorporate, and kind of the texture of it all. And asking that question helped us understand first what types of dishes might be prime for swapping out, but it also tells us what flavor profiles and cuisines are of interest, and kind of like what they prioritize when it comes to the dish itself. And then we asked them a follow-up question, also still a generative question, where we asked them how they would convince their friends to try out this new dish. And that helped us kind of understand what positive narratives resonate with the particular participant and how their friends might perceive beans. And it also helped us understand to what degree would they talk about the presence of beans in the dish. Would they try to hide the fact that there are beans and kind of let people be surprised by it, or kind of spill the beans, if you will, and set expectations on what's in the dish. But overall, our mission had 6 different activities, and we started kind of broad with food behaviors and then got more specific into memories about beans, perceptions of beans, and then getting into testing specific messages and influencers that they follow and resonate with. Yeah. And yeah, so the analysis for all of this occurred both in Dscout with lots of tagging, and then plopping things into Miro, as you can see in some of this organized chaos that we have here. And throughout, we've used color-coded stickies, kind of indicating data that's more focused on eater needs versus eater values, or really getting into narratives and trusted voices among this particular audience. So it's kind of an overview of like what we did within Dscout. And then next I can speak to some of the highlights of the eater needs and some of the kind of key behaviors. And then after that, the narratives that we uncovered. Yeah. All right, so here is kind of a snapshot. So our eater audience from Dscout, they really value the kind of personal impacts of their food choices over external impacts like eating for the environment or for one's local or global community. They often look to social media, but they also look to family and friends when making food choices or having influence on their food choices. And overall, this group that we focus on initially keep a relatively low food budget and opt for lower cost food spending categories, particularly groceries, casual dining, and fast food. And in terms of some of their barriers to beans, mirrored a lot of what we already saw in our secondary research. So, you know, those typical things like digestive issues, taste and texture, not sure how to prepare them, especially for dry beans, and those kinds of things. And on the next slide here is a bit of a behind the scenes of how we use self-determination theory in our research. So with pretty much every audience that we work with, we assess their sense of community, control, and purpose. And testing these kind of signals to us, where are their core needs at? Where were they being met? Where are they not being met? And this helps us inform what types of framing would resonate well with this particular audience. So in this audience here, we saw that pride within their city was pretty high. But at the same time, there was a little bit lower sense of control or feeling a sense of autonomy in their life. So from this tells us that the messaging that we may need to put in front of people about beans should speak more to their goals and values, not be so directive in that you must eat beans because it's so good for you and it's so sustainable, but speaking to like what matters to them so they can make their own choice, as well as highlighting city identities to this particular audience. And then from there, we also looked at perceptions through the lens of bean dishes and different types of formats. And we have that on the next slide here. And we did this through a ranking question and also looking at open-ended responses and counting how many times did they say baked beans or chili or the different types of kind of cuisines that came up in our various open-ended responses. So overall, there are some pretty broad associations with Mexican and Caribbean cuisines, but also some interest in Indian and Mediterranean flavors as well. And then qualitatively, this audience was interested in just like these dishes in particular because they seemed familiar, had visual appeal, appeared healthy, and appeared filling to them. And so that's kind of the highlights of the key behaviors. And next, I'll speak to our winning narratives. And this is through a series of direct questions, kind of ranking many different options, but then pulling out indirect open-ended responses from bottom-up themes. And here we've kind of showed a bit of a spectrum with our analysis of what resonates the most, what's kind of resonating less. And we were also able to compare with our audience, particularly between white and Black participants. And we can see on the top right that health is one that resonated with many people, but then in some areas, in some themes, they were kind of split. So protein, sustainability, and our food justice and African American heritage themes were split between these groups. And to illustrate like how they talked about these themes in the Dscout mission, we had our scouts pick their top theme and then talk about it as if they were posting on social media. And so it was another generative activity that we wove into the mission, and we have that on the next slide, I think. Great.
I think it's general and inclusive of everyone. There were other prompts that were listed that were, I felt, excluded certain groups of people.
not like how it's going to affect me like 20 years from now, but like, tomorrow, if I eat beans, I'm not going to feel sluggish. And that's the energy I need to get through my day.
And saying something about hitting your protein count and working out specifically around weightlifters and people who like to lift weights and have bigger muscles. I think that's a better approach you're doing.
I would include maybe like oh, it's a Chicago bean dish, but it's incorporated in throughout many different cities all over the world. Kind of like bringing back to that whole concept of inclusiveness, diversity, bringing people together.
A lot of people have negative connotations about beans because they're thinking like very stereotypically, or like thinking about beans in a very generic way of just like eating straight beans, like baked beans or something like that. Whereas you can really like, kind of subtly add them to a lot of different dishes, to the point where you don't even taste the beans when you're eating the dish.
Is, hearty meals, perseverance, and it goes beyond food actually. So if you're able to straddle the line of culinary significance and historical significance, I feel like that will be the best thing that you can do with this messaging.
Yeah, so from all of these rich perspectives, we had a little over 40 participants in this mission, and sifting through hundreds of quotes from all of our questions here. Our team iterated upon our narratives and then testing those at a larger scale. And this was done on a separate platform with an audience of about 250 eaters, again, in the Chicago area. And we split those participants up into these 6 different conditions plus a control to see which resonated the most. And we measured that by first exposing them to the particular message and then asking follow-up questions about their intentions to consume beans, and then questions about their perceptions of beans. So asking, various things to get at that. So that beans are tasty, that they're versatile, etc. And so I'm going to pause here because I think we're going to have a poll that I think Colleen will post in a second. So take a moment to read over these narratives. And then when the poll is up, let us know which of these excites you the most to enjoy bean dishes. And then I'll reveal what we learned from our test.
Yes, let me just launch it. All right. Yeah, which of these narratives excites you the most to try more bean dishes? It'll be interesting to see, like, if the same top few seem to emerge. Let's see. Okay, we're at about 70% participation. So I'm gonna end, a couple more people. I'll end the poll and share the results for folks. So yeah, it's interesting that it's kind of split across like these top ones emerging.
Yeah, so it looks like body health and plant-based protein and energy are kind of the main clusters. All right.
Yeah, I wonder too if city food culture is maybe less of a factor with like a non-local audience.
That's true. Yeah, and that's something that we'll be investigating in our next steps of how to frame this in a way that's maybe not too specific to a city, or it all depends on like what's the specific context that we'll be kind of working within for our next steps here. Great. But yeah, so I'll reveal the results of our test here on the next slide. And it was actually city food culture. And so we found that one that actually had like the most positive effect. And then the two that also were also effective were this treat reward message and this plant-based protein message. And in addition to that, we were able to isolate the effects across racial groups and note some of the differences which are outlined in that box below. And that all of that helps us frame messaging to specific audiences. So from there, we're currently testing these narratives in a real world context. And yeah, so that's here. And then we're testing this in a university dining hall, and we're seeing which of these two narratives are more effective. So the first one is more of this kind of energy and plant-based protein narrative. So you'll notice, well, it might be kind of hard to read on your screen. We're kind of combining the energy and plant-based protein in that first one. And then on the second one is leaning into that city food culture narrative and the kind of treat reward language into one. So we're comparing the two with the serving data, also comparing that with baseline data from kind of pre-test data. And I'm really excited to see what the results of that will be. Can't share too many more details on that, but moving on from like this test, we're continuing to scale up our testing to other regions, looking to pilot narratives with other universities, other food service contexts, working with different types of influencers. And again, all this is to inform these different best practices that can be integrated into kind of a larger scale campaign to engage Gen Z and millennial eaters. So yeah, that's the gist of everything. I know we have lots of time for questions, so we're excited to answer those.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did save plenty of time for questions at the end. So I don't think we'll need to spill over into our People Nerd Slack space. But if you have any questions for Stephanie or Tavi, I've seen a few have already come in. Just submit them either to the chat or to the Q&A box, and we can start getting some of those answered. I think the first question that I have or that has come in is that for the next steps of the campaign, I know you'd mentioned like branching out into other like cities and localities. Will you, take the work that was informed by what you've done on Dscout and then expand to the different cities, or will you kind of do any other like new narrative testing on like a site like Dscout, for example?
That's a good question. That's something that the team, like entire team, is kind of grappling with right now, of like what's our next best approach. So I'm not sure how detailed I can be in that answer, so I'm going to let Chavi answer that.
Sure. Yeah. So doing additional research on Dscout is not out of the question. We are thinking whether it's worth to do a more national survey versus a more targeted study, because we have found Dscout to be most beneficial when you have a really good boundary around which audience segment you're going after, so that you can really get deep with them and understand their lifestyles. And so it's almost the best scenario if you have a very specific pilot audience where you know for a fact that you will be engaging with them also with the interventions later. So we wanted to target university students as well from our study. So if we expand in other cities, focusing specifically on university students, then yes, we would likely do another similar study with university students in another geography. But if we go towards a more national campaign direction, we might do more of a survey style, traditional.
I think there's a couple of other questions that have come out that are kind of similar to what you've just talked about. One of them is, how did you determine the qualities that you use to divide your audiences?
Great question.
Yeah, that's our like audience segmentation work. So we scoured a range of secondary sources from like USDA, NHANES, and a couple other databases to basically map out what are these different audiences intentions to consume and current consumption. And so we wanted to target groups that have kind of higher intentions but might not eat a lot of beans at this time, but understanding like what are their barriers to eating more beans, and then what do they value, and then we can frame the messaging that would encourage them to eat beans. I don't know, Chavi, if you wanted to add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so our matrix has been about intention and consumption, because ultimately our work is focused on closing the intention consumption gap. So most of the research that Stephanie was referencing was data on communities that have a high intention of consuming beans. And those are typically questions in surveys like, how likely are you to consume beans the next week? But when we tally that data with their current consumption patterns, they're not eating as much. So that just makes them the nice sort of low-hanging fruit to say, okay, these people do want to eat more beans, but they're currently not eating more beans. So let's dig deeper and understand why aren't they eating more beans? And that's the barrier that Stephanie was talking about. And then with our new narratives, let's try to address those barriers that can then create more positive perceptions, as well as more great availability of great bean options in their specific contexts.
Excellent. More questions have come in around like defining audiences, around background, culture, but also like, I know your work so far has been mostly centered around like millennial and Gen Z folks. So one question was that they'd love to learn a little bit more about how you defined the audience, especially where cooking experience may have factored in, if people who are more inexperienced with cooking with beans like factored into how participants may have responded, particularly if people are on the younger side.
I don't know if we explicitly like segmented our audience based on like their cooking skills, but just from the dishes that they had described, like a dish that they were kind of like making at home, and dishes that, or like a go-to bean dish that they make that was like one of our video responses. They weren't anything particularly fancy, I guess you would say, or high, you know, culinary status, which is fair. It's not, you know, common for someone to whip out a Michelin star bean dish. So I think there was a little bit of a range from, you know, simple dishes that they were kind of making in the moment to some that maybe had a little bit more complexity to them. So I think that kind of like the needs around like cooking and like cooking literacy might also need to be addressed for interventions that are more focused about cooking beans at home and like shopping for beans and knowing how to incorporate them on your day-to-day versus making an intervention that's more focused on like a food service context, like ordering something in a restaurant will require something, language and intervention that's maybe slightly different.
Absolutely. And kind of curious of how much cost came up during research in terms of like the lower cost of beans with what participants had shared.
Yeah, so affordability came out frequently. It's kind of like it's kind of like a double-edged sword because beans are affordable and they're very accessible from a price point standpoint, but by extension, they're kind of maybe almost overlooked because they're kind of this pantry staple. But overall affordability was something that was kind of like an add-on to many of the like the broader attributes that we had brought up in the themes that we shared here. So it's kind of a smaller actor. It's kind of hits your base level needs, but it doesn't really speak to like your higher level values of like indulging oneself or being part of a community. So Shali, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and that showed up a lot in our secondary research, especially because the current narrative around beans is often it's the ultimate food donation drive food. It's a war ration, and that's exactly the kind of perception that we want to shift. That made us want to focus a little bit more on the low-income communities as well, because they can really benefit. We all can benefit by eating more beans. It's a highly nutritious ingredient. But specifically for them, this narrative was very much alive that eating beans is food for the non-prosperous. And so I shouldn't eat beans for that reason. And that's the narrative we want to change and shift, that beans are actually can be equally indulgent and delicious and rich.
Absolutely. Another question was around measurement of, you know, what are you both thinking in terms of measuring like impact and success for the project?
Great questions. For us, we define impact by climate actions and by going through shifting perceptions. So we are measuring our impact both on positive perceptions associated with beans, as well as how many more bean dishes get adopted in these specific dining halls where we are currently running our studies.
Excellent. I think an extension of that question is, you know, who's the consumer of this research? one of the audience member asked, do you intend to launch your own campaign or partner with additional organizations? I know you kind of mentioned that in the beginning of the presentation, but if we could kind of circle back to that in terms of, what's next after the dining hall in terms of larger campaigns and partnerships.
And I'm so glad we had that discussion at the team call today because we are like literally having these exact same discussions, that we still have some more testing to do before we can start planning towards the next sort of scale up. But our intention is to do more pilots and more tests so that this can become a toolkit. With our data, we can empower other people in the bean ecosystem and the bean community, from bean CPG companies to restaurants that offer beans, to chefs, to different influencers, to US Dry Beans Council, all these big organizations that can leverage these narratives that we have researched and tested in a variety of contexts to promote beans at their end. So our goal is to partner for these pilots and then eventually hand over this research material to someone else who would likely be running a campaign or multiple campaigns.
That makes sense. Another question was, how do you plan your research to get enough data and insights to answer the research questions, such as like the timeline, and kind of how do you know when you have enough data to be able to like make a decision or determination around the impact that you've made?
Yeah, that's a continual challenge for me, because I always want to learn more, but I always start with just like kind of outlining like what are those key objectives, and noting like as early on, like knowing when we will be successful if we do, or if we answer this, this, and this. And then mapping out like any, like whether it's a Dscout mission or some other type of like research instrument, making sure that every question that you're asking is going back to one or more of those objectives, and having a plan for how you intend to use that data, and from an analysis standpoint, but then how are you going to communicate that to to your team and to any potential partners or clients, to inform then whatever type of thing that you might be designing, whether it's a narrative or a design intervention or an app or whatever it is you happen to be working on. And so like knowing when to stop is kind of hard to say, but like I think being able to articulate like what the end goal is at the beginning and then just kind of tracking that along the way is kind of the best way to know when to be done. I don't know, maybe that was like a little bit too general of how I answered it, but Chavi, if you have something maybe a little more specific to how we do that at FCL.
Yeah, and there are a few different ways also within FCL and beyond that you can draw from the management consulting world. You can draw from this lean startup world as experiments, and I think there's something to be said up first about, from the management consulting world, like tightly scoping and defining your impact metrics as early as you can at the start of the project, so that you know yourself by virtue of definition of those impact metrics that when you have achieved those metrics, and how much research is enough to inform those metrics. Drawing from the lean startup world and also a lot of the rigorous academic experimentation says that generative research is important and it should be done, and you should deeply engage with your audience. But it's more important to eventually then test those whatever's coming out of your generative research, whether it's new concepts, new narratives, new solutions. So I recommend doing this sort of iterative approach where you do a little bit of Dscout, you go and run a survey test, a quantitative test, or a real world test, then you come back, go deeper again on other issues, and then go back and test it. So continuously testing is the best way to know when you have enough evidence to claim that you are able to actually shift the perceptions or shift the behaviors or create that impact that you're looking to create.
Excellent. I think this is going to be our last question. Do either of you have any thoughts on how to scale the experiment to locations where beans are not part of the heritage or culture, or maybe not even being based in a city? Like, is there any interest in extending past like a city location.
Meaning like a suburban context?
Suburban or like rural context.
The beans are so ubiquitous, they're everywhere. How I always find it hard to find a place.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's possibility to explore how beans are perceived beyond city. Like, I mean, I'm a Midwest girly, and I'm interested in how, just people in kind of lower population areas, like what's their food culture like, and how can beans be part of that? And one avenue that we're exploring is the role of universities, and so that those aren't always in metropolitan areas either. I think we still have a pretty broad landscape of audiences and contexts that we can investigate further to build out our toolkit.
Well, with that, we're gonna share a link to the FCL website if folks are interested in learning more or downloading their more recent report in the chat here. So definitely click into that, explore their site. And I do want to say thank you everyone for joining, as well as a huge thank you to Chavi and Stephanie and the whole Food for Climate League on sharing your insights and experiences with us today. Everyone who joined will get a copy of the recording within the next day or so. So, keep your eyes out for that. And if you'd like to continue, conversations like this one, or you want to just get those bean recipes from earlier that were dropped in the chat, we'll be sharing that in our People Nerd Slack community. So we'll drop in just like a link for folks to join that Slack if you'd like to. And there's more conversations similar to this one that go on in that Slack community. So we'd love to have you join us. But have a great rest of your day, everyone, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.